On 7th of October, the unexpected hit. Israel shook in terror. There was fire and smoke following an airstrike. Gaza soils witnessed a terrific blast. Forks shattered. There's a lot on the line. First, you should know that Gaza is the largest city in Palestine. The hit probably shook the whole of Palestine. Now, let's check the war history with me, Krishnendu Nair. Palestinian Islamist militant groups led by Hamas. To be more specific about the Hamas, they govern the Gaza Strip, home to 2 million people. Now, Hamas launched an extensive invasion and offensive against Israel from Gaza Strip, breaking through the Gaza-Israel barrier and forcing entry via Gaza border crossings into nearby Israeli settlements and military installations. The decades-long dispute over land and sovereignty, a religious conflict once, is now an existential crisis. Once it was the Arab-Israeli conflict. Later, typically after World War I, this conflict became the Israel-Palestine conflict, which involved Israelis who primarily identified as Jewish, Palestinians who are mainly Arab Muslims, as well as other minority groups. The Israel-Palestine conflict is marked by its complexity and the deeply held aspirations of both Israelis and Palestinians. Resolving it remains a significant challenge in international diplomacy. Also, the status of Jerusalem, claimed by Israelis and Palestinians as their capital, remains a central issue. The history of these conflicts dates back to the formation of Israel in 1947. Since then, Israel has been a hotbed of disputes for over a century. Beginning in the late 19th century, it's one of the world's longest, deadliest and continuing conflicts. Various attempts have been made to resolve the conflict as part of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, alongside other efforts to solve the broader Arab-Israeli conflict. The Arab-Israeli War of 1948 was the first ever war that occurred in the region immediately after the formation of independent Israel. Hundreds of Palestinians were forced out of their homes and described it as Al-Nakba, or the catastrophe. Neighboring Arab states including Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq and Lebanon also faced the consequences of the war that went on for more than a year. The war ended in 1949 with Israel's victory. Later, on July 26, 1956, Suez Crisis, known as the Suez War, an international crisis in the Middle East, precipitated when the Egyptian president Gamal Abdel Nasser, who had a hostile stance towards the Israel, nationalized the Suez Canal. The canal had been owned by the Suez Canal Company, which was controlled by French and British interests. This conflict primarily involved Israel, the United Kingdom and France, who struck a deal against Egypt. Israel wanted to gain control of the Sinai Peninsula and end Palestinian Fadain attacks from Egyptian territory. In a span of 5 days, the Israeli army invaded the Sinai Peninsula and captured Gaza, Rafah and Al-Arish. However, the conflict ended 2 months later due to international pressure and the intervention of the UN, and Israel withdrew from Sinai. Later in 1967, Israel fought a brief war known as the Six-Day War with Egypt, Jordan and Syria, capturing the West Bank, Gaza Strip, East Jerusalem and the Global Heights. The occupation of these territories remains a central issue in the conflict. 6 years later in 1973, Yom Kippur War, also known as the October War or Ramadan War, began sporadically and developed into a full-blown war when Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel during the Jewish holiday of Yom Kippur. The war lasted for the entire duration of the Islamic holy month of Ramadan. It ended with Israel and Egypt signing a formal ceasefire agreement. In 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon in response of Palestinian attacks and to remove the Palestinian Liberation Organization or PLO from Lebanese territory. The increased tensions between Israel and Palestine resulted in the bombing of Beirut and southern Lebanon. Israel invaded and gained control of Lebanon with the PLO still resisting. The war went on for 3 years till Israeli troops completely withdrew from Lebanon in 1985. Then, in July 2006, Hezbollah, a Shiite political and military organization based in Lebanon with its extensive rocket arsenal, launched an operation into northern Israel, killing many Israeli soldiers and causing civilian casualties and damages. Hezbollah wanted to pressure the country into releasing Lebanese prisoners, but Israel launched a counter-offensive that left over 1,000 Lebanese dead and nearly 1 million displaced. A conflict started in December 2008 after Israel launched a military operation in Gaza Strip in response to rocket launches by Palestinian militants. The war lasted 3 weeks with significant casualties on both sides. On November 14, 2012, Israel launched an air military operation, Pillar of Defense, against the terrorist organization Hamas and the Islamic Jihad leadership in Gaza. The operation lasted 8 days. Again on July 8, 2014, Israel launched Operation Protective Edge, which also came to be known as the 2014 Gaza War. The 50-day conflict was one of the deadliest escalations between Israel and Hamas in recent times. The conflict resulted in significant civilian casualties and infrastructure damage in Gaza. The ceasefire was brokered by Egypt and the UN. The conflict of May 2021 started with tensions in East Jerusalem after Israel claimed to protect itself from Palestinian violence. There were clashes at the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Israeli threats to evict Palestinian families from the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood added fuel to the fire. The fighting went on for 11 days, killing at least 250 people in Gaza and 13 in Israel. The conflict is a deeply complex and long-standing conflict marked by historical grievances, compelling narratives, and deeply held aspirations on both sides. Achieving a just and lasting resolution remains a challenging endeavor, one that requires empathy, diplomacy, and compromise. There have been countless efforts to find a peaceful resolution, but so far the situation has remained temperamental. The hope for a future where Israelis and Palestinians can coexist in peace and security with self-determination and respect for human rights remains a shared goal for the international community.